They said power came from oil, then they said it came from data, but in the world we live in now, power has a new name: medicine. Because whoever controls your medicine controls your life. And in 2021, as the world gasped for breath during a pandemic, a quiet revolution began, one that Washington never saw coming, from the biotech labs of Pune to the runways of Abuja, Accra, and Nairobi. A nation once dismissed as a developing country was now delivering what the world's richest nations were hoarding hope in a vial. India didn't just send vaccines, it sent a message that said, we are not just the pharmacy of the world. We are its new conscience, and for the first time in modern history, Africa wasn't looking west for help, it was looking east. In the heart of Africa, something historic was happening. India's vaccine Maitri, its friendship initiative, was doing what America's pharmaceutical giants never could: deliver vaccines without strings attached, no long contracts, no political conditions, just medicine shared, not sold. To Washington, it looked like charity. But to New Delhi, it was strategy, soft power in its purest form, and to Africa, it was justice. While the US and Europe debated patent protection, India quietly flooded Africa with vaccines. Over 30 African nations from Ghana to Kenya to Nigeria received millions of doses manufactured in India. Hospitals that once waited for aid from Washington were now receiving shipments from Mumbai. And leaders across Africa noticed, in a single year, India became Africa's most trusted health partner, and that trust was earned, not bought. But in Washington, alarms were ringing. For decades, Big Pharma, the billion-dollar machine behind America's global power, had ruled the world as medicine. Through USAID, Gavi, and the World Bank, the US built a quiet empire, one that decided which drugs Africa could buy, what prices they paid, and who controlled their supply chains. It wasn't just about saving lives, it was about controlling markets. But India's entry shattered that model. Where the US offered patents, India offered partnerships. Where the West demanded compliance, India offered cooperation. And in the process, it began rewriting the rules of global health power. At the height of the pandemic, the Serum Institute of India, the world's largest vaccine manufacturer, was producing 3 million doses a day, not just for Indians, but for Africans, Asians, and Latin Americans alike. When Western factories stopped exporting, India stepped in, and when the G7 hoarded vaccines for themselves, India sent planes to Kigali, Lagos, and Maputo. It wasn't just medicine that India was exporting, it was trust, and trust is the one currency Washington no longer owns. Across the continent, the mood began to shift. From Ghana's rural clinics to Nigeria's cities, African doctors began saying something unthinkable a decade ago: we don't have to depend on America anymore. Because India was not giving aid, it was building capacity, training African scientists, sharing technology, even helping nations set up local manufacturing plants. To the old powers, this wasn't cooperation, it was competition. And for Washington, that competition cut deep because it struck at the very heart of its pharma empire. That's when the pushback began. Suddenly, Western media questioned the quality of Indian vaccines. Analysts called them rushed, risky, unverified. But the truth? Africa trusted them, because while American companies negotiated, India delivered. Every dose that arrived on time told a story the West didn't want told: that the world no longer needed America to survive. In 2022, India joined forces with South Africa to demand a waiver on vaccine patents. They argued, life-saving medicine should not be trapped behind corporate walls. The US resisted, because it knew if Africa gained vaccine independence, it would lose one of its strongest levers of control. To Washington, this wasn't about health, it was about hegemony. But 2 million across Africa, that sounded like arrogance, not policy. From Lagos to Nairobi, a new movement was taking shape: young scientists, entrepreneurs, and doctors inspired by what India had done. They weren't begging for donations, they were building labs, opening factories, and forming the foundation of what some are calling Africa's new health order, an order that doesn't rely on American aid but thrives on African innovation and Indian partnership. The world was watching, and for the first time in decades, Africa wasn't a patient, it was a player. And now, America wants back in. It's promising billions in health aid, announcing new initiatives, talking about restoring trust. But on the ground, things have changed, because once Africa tasted independence, it could never go back. India may have broken the monopoly, but Africa is breaking the system. This isn't just about vaccines, it's about a shift in global power. A new world being born, where influence is measured not in weapons or dollars, but in health. And as America scrambles to protect its pharmaceutical empire, India is quietly building something far greater: a bridge of medicine that connects the global south and redefines who truly cares when the world gets sick. Because, in this new age of power, the real battlefield isn't in Washington or Beijing, it's in the bloodstream of a continent where hope, politics, and profit all fight for control.
When the pandemic struck, the world froze. pharmaceutical empires scrambled for patents, profits, and power. The United States, home of Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, thought its dominance would remain unshaken. Yet as America focused inward, India looked outward. With a single decision, New Delhi began sending hope in tiny glass bottles, not to Europe, not to America, but to Africa. For the first time in modern history, Africa wasn't just a patient, it was a partner. From Nigeria to Kenya, Rwanda to Ghana, Indian vaccines arrived where American ones couldn't or wouldn't. Affordable, accessible, delivered without lectures. Too many African leaders, India wasn't just filling a health gap, it was dismantling a monopoly, because behind every vaccine contract lies an empire. And America's pharmaceutical empire was built on control. For decades, Western firms dictated who gets what, when, and at what cost. Aid came with strings attached, sometimes invisible, sometimes wrapped in diplomacy. But India brought something else: trust, a promise that health should not be a privilege. In Kigali, a plan is forming an Africa that makes its own vaccines. In Nairobi, doctors train under Indian mentorship. In Abuja, ministers speak of medical independence. And behind it all, India's pharmaceutical giants, Serum Institute, Bharat Biotech, biologically names once obscure, now echoing in global boardrooms once ruled by Western Pharma. Because this isn't just about medicine. It's about markets worth billions and influence that shapes nations. Every vaccine batch shipped from India to Africa chips away at America's control not only of drugs but of diplomacy itself. To the US, Africa has long been a terrain of assistance. To India, it's becoming a field of partnership. That difference is seismic, and Washington can feel the ground moving. But this story isn't one of villains and heroes. It's about power and how it changes hands. For years, Africa depended on the pipelines of others. Now it's building its own. India's entry into Africa's health sector isn't charity, it's strategy. A strategy that aligns with a continent finally demanding autonomy. What once arrived as aid is now arriving as alliance. And that, for the first time, makes Africa the decider. But with every shift in power comes a shadow. US pharmaceutical lobbies are not sitting idle. They're pressuring African regulators, pushing new patents, and funding rival initiatives, all to keep their foothold in a continent that's starting to walk away. Meanwhile, Indian firms are doubling down, offering not just vaccines, but technology transfer and joint production deals. If Africa can make its own medicine, Big Pharma loses its leash. To Washington, this isn't just competition, it's defiance. A quiet rebellion spreading through syringes and signatures. They say the next global war won't be fought with bullets but with biology, data, and trust. In that war, vaccines are the new weapons. And whoever controls the cure controls the future. India knows it. America knows it. And Africa finally knows it too. From Delhi to Dakar, from Washington to Nairobi, a silent race for Africa's bloodstream has begun. And this time, the winner won't just rewrite the map of medicine. They'll redefine what global power truly means. It started quietly. While the world was frozen under lockdowns, a small city in western India, Pune, became the heartbeat of global survival. Inside the gates of the Serum Institute of India, workers in hazmat suits worked around the clock, producing millions of vaccine doses. The mission was simple: to vaccinate humanity. But behind that mission was a strategy, one that would alter global power forever. India called it the Vaccine Maitri Initiative, friendship through vaccines. To the world, it was humanitarian aid. To strategists in Washington, it was soft power diplomacy on steroids. Because every vial shipped carried more than medicine. It carried influence. In less than a year, India became the largest vaccine supplier to developing nations, over 100 countries, 30 of them in Africa. Kenya, Nigeria, Rwanda, Ghana all received doses not from the West but from the East. Too many African leaders. India was doing what the United States never had, offering health without politics, technology without conditions, friendship without dependency. India stood by us when others turned their backs, one official said. That single sentence echoed louder than any speech from Washington. But America's unease wasn't only about generosity, it was about control. For decades, the West controlled Africa's health systems through USAID, Pfizer, and Gavi, institutions that shaped policies, funded research, and dictated prices. Big Pharma didn't just sell drugs, it sold dependence. When India entered the arena, it didn't play by those rules. It undercut prices, it offered technology transfers, and it trained African scientists. Suddenly, Washington's billion-dollar health architecture started to look outdated and vulnerable. Africa, too, was changing. The African Union launched a new goal, to produce 60% of the continent's vaccines locally by 2040. That target was impossible without partners, and India arrived at the perfect moment. In Rwanda, India announced plans for joint vaccine production. In Ghana, it offered to set up biotech training programs. In Nigeria, it pledged to help strengthen cold chain logistics, the invisible infrastructure of vaccine power. For the first time, health wasn't being donated, it was being shared. That's what terrified Washington. Because if Africa could produce its own vaccines with India's help, it could also produce its own policy. The U.S. saw a nightmare forming. A world where Africa no longer relied on Western medicine, where Indian generic power erased billion-dollar patent profits, and where vaccine diplomacy turned into political loyalty. Those were the public words. But the private concern was simpler. America was losing control of Africa's bloodstream. Yet to Africa, this wasn't a power game, it was survival. For decades, health decisions had been made outside the continent. Now, for the first time, Africa had a say and a partner that listened. When Indian scientists shared vaccine formulas, when African labs began to replicate the process, it wasn't just technology being exchanged, it was trust. In those small, sterile rooms, a quiet revolution was beginning. But revolutions rarely go unchallenged. Reports soon emerged of U.S. lobbying to limit patent waivers under the two trade officials whispered warnings about quality control, and American pharma giants launched partnerships to reassert presence. But this time, Africa had options, and India had momentum. Every new partnership signed, every factory opened, every dose shipped was one more sign that the health order was changing. It wasn't just India helping Africa. It was Africa learning to help itself through India. To the West, it looked like competition. To Africa, it felt like freedom. And to India, it was destiny, the next chapter in its journey to lead the global South. But this new alliance was still fragile. Because while vaccines were healing people, they were also exposing fault lines between nations, between companies, and between the past and the future. And as the US and India quietly battle for control of Africa's health future, one question remains in a world where medicine means power. Who truly decides who gets to live? Power doesn't fade quietly. When India's vaccines began flooding African ports, Washington's silence wasn't acceptance, it was strategy. Behind closed doors, something was shifting. The message was clear: if India could win Africa's trust through health, America had to reclaim that trust by any means necessary. The first response came not from politicians, but from Big Pharma. Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, companies that had made billions during the pandemic, suddenly began talking about reinvestment in Africa. New foundations appeared overnight, partnership conferences, scholarships for African scientists, even promises of vaccine plants, all backed by familiar Western names. But there was one problem: the deals came with strings attached. Every handshake came with control, every partnership came with oversight, and every dollar came with an agenda. Then came the narrative war. American think tanks and media began running studies questioning India's vaccine standards. They called them rushed, unverified, undertested. But African nations had already used millions of those doses and seen results. Hospitals weren't overflowing, deaths were down, confidence was rising. Washington's words were losing their magic, because what was happening in Africa wasn't about charity, it was partnership. And partnership breeds independence. In 2022, the debate reached the global stage. India and South Africa jointly demanded a waiver on vaccine patents, arguing that life-saving formulas shouldn't be corporate secrets. The U.S. resisted fiercely, because once Africa gained the ability to make its own medicine, the West would lose one of its oldest tools of leverage. The battle lines were drawn not between companies but between two worldviews, one that believed health is profit, and one that believed health is power to be shared. Across the continent, the message was spreading: Africa could no longer wait for permission to survive. With India's help, new biotech hubs were announced in Kigali, in Nairobi, in Lagos. Young scientists trained in Pune and Hyderabad returned home, not as employees but as innovators. It was the rise of a new generation of African scientists, armed not with Western grants but Indian know-how. They weren't just making vaccines, they were making history. But Washington wasn't done. New health aid packages began appearing, billions of dollars in funding, conditional on transparency, alignment with global partners, and data sharing agreements. On paper, They looked harmless. In reality, they were diplomatic pressure designed to keep Africa within Washington's orbit. Visuals. A map showing arrows of U.S. influence meeting India's expanding outreach across Africa. It was now an invisible war fought not with bullets but with biotech, funding, and patents. For Africa, it was a strange. Vu. Two giants fighting for influence on a continent still healing from centuries of foreign control. But this time, Africa had leverage. It had choices. It had knowledge. And perhaps for the first time, it had allies that spoke the same language of development, not dominance. To the average citizen, the politics meant nothing. What mattered were the vials in hospitals, the doctors on the ground, and the chance to live without being a pawn. And so, America doubled down. It tried to reassert moral leadership, promoting the Build Back Better World initiative, rebranding old policies in new words. But in Africa's streets, something was already shifting. The flags of Made in India vaccines, once small, now fluttered proudly next to local logos. The symbols of the Global South: cooperation, equality, and shared growth were no longer slogans. They were reality. In this quiet health revolution, India didn't conquer Africa, it collaborated. And that simple difference is what Washington never understood, because in the 21st century, power doesn't come from armies, or even from oil. It comes from health, trust, and technology. And as the U.S. struggles to hold on to its pharma empire, India and Africa are writing their own prescription for a future no superpower can control. This isn't just a vaccine story, it's the story of how medicine became the new politics. And how Africa with India by its side is rewriting the rules of global power.